Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Soul Seekers podcast, where we believe that hunting has the power to transform lives through primal adventure as we share our mission of mentorship is conservation. To learn more about everything we do, check out our show on Carbon TV or go to soulseekersnation.com. Freedom on, everybody, and stay soulful. This podcast is also proudly brought to you by Onyx Hunt. When I first got into hunting, I kept hearing all about public land and different access and how to find different locations to hunt. I was like, well, how are people even identifying all this stuff? Well, sure enough, I came across the number one hunting GPS app, and that is Onyx Hunt. If you guys want to get better at hunting and go deeper into your scouting, Onyx Hunt is the number one GPS app for that. Join the millions of hunters who trust Onyx Hunt to find more game, discover new access, and hunt smarter. It was a game changer for me, and I know it's going to be a game changer for you if you've never used it. If you have used it, you know the power that it holds. Guys, I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you want to know more about Onyx, go to onyxmaps.com/hunt and check out their app. Be blessed, freedom on, and stay soulful. All right, guys, if you're in the market for a new hunting rifle this coming year, look no further than a Kelbley's rifle. I've been rocking their Coda rifle for the last couple seasons, and I've had great success with it. It's an amazing shooter, and every time I put one of their rifles in somebody's hands, they're like, oh, I got to get one of these. Kelbley's holds over 92 world and national records that are either broken or set on one of their actions or rifles. So they really set a higher level of accuracy. If you want to know more about Kelbley's rifles, go to kelbley.com. That's KELBLY.com. Tell them Johnny Mack sent you with Soul Seekers, and go enjoy shooting that much more in this coming hunting season. Be blessed, everybody. Go check out Kelbley Rifles. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Soul Seekers podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Mack, and today's episode is one for the record books because as I looked back onto 2024 and one of the top episodes that were listened to of the podcast, it actually went back to when the podcast was originally called The Soulful Hunter before we rebranded to Soul Seekers. And that podcast was Blacktail Hunting 101, where we talk about the gray ghosts of the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast and all about how to hunt blacktail deer, the mysterious animals that never show themselves unless it's the end of October and the beginning of November, and then you never see them again unless you live on an apple farm and you got a bunch of orchards and all that. So without further ado, we got the man of the hour is Mr. Tom Ryle, who came on for episode 32 of the podcast. We're having him back, and we're going to be diving into all things Blacktail 101. Now, the last time we had this episode, I recorded this without even having the experience of killing a deer. Since then, I've only killed a blacktail doe, but a lot of my majority of deer hunting has actually been whitetail, which has a lot of similarities and crossovers when it comes to hunting blacktail deer. So we're going to be diving into this, and the man of the hour is the magician of the blacktail woods, as I like to call him. He might say otherwise, but he's also the creator of pnwbowhunting.com. It's a resource for all things hunting and new hunters, and if you want to learn about archery hunting and blacktail deer and all that. He's a great writer, great author, and my friend Tom Ryle. Tom, thanks for coming on the show, brother.
Thanks, Johnny. I appreciate it. It's always good to talk to you, and I haven't seen you in a while. So for those listening, we get the video and you don't. So
yeah, that might be a goal for 2025 to start releasing video podcasts. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah, Tom, it is good to see your face, man. I think the last time we did this, I don't even think I even did video calls at that time. I think it was more like cell phone and just recorded off the cell phone.
I think it was a cell phone, and then you took the podcasting thing, jumped in the way you do with everything, and created a really awesome platform for a lot of great guests. And I'm honored to be back and talk about the craziness that is blacktail deer hunting.
Yeah. So before we dive into this, I want to ask you a couple questions. Number one, where did your obsession with blacktail deer come from?
Well, I grew up obviously in the Pacific Northwest, and the irony there is I never hunted blacktails. I grew up, got my hunter ed certification at 12, and we went to Eastern Washington to hunt mule deer and elk. And it wasn't really until I was in college and I was working at a machine shop, and one of my coworkers brought his compound bow to work and wanted to shoot, at lunch hour or whatever. And I was like, dang, what are you doing out here? Like, this looks cool. So I shot his bow, and that next weekend bought a bow out of the newspaper. Didn't know what I was doing. Bought a used old Browning. I don't even remember what it was called, Cam Master or something like that. It had a wood riser, and it was back a few years. But I just jumped in with both feet, and then it kind of was like this big light bulb moment that, holy cow, I can bow hunt locally. And the season was really long. And I'm like, when you're going to college and you got rifle seasons, you only have maybe a weekend in there to bomb across the state.
Yep.
Hunt a couple days and your season's over for a whole year.
Yeah.
But with archery, I was able to expand my season. And so that was kind of the start. And it really became kind of a discovery situation where I didn't know a thing about black-tailed deer. I just see deer on the side of the road. I knew they were different than mule deer. I knew they weren't whitetails. I knew they were black-tailed deer. But, at that time I never looked at them as something that I would actually hunt. Never saw a big buck anywhere, not even during those magical weeks around the end of October and early November. Never even saw big roadkills or anything. So I just never really thought about hunting them until I got a bow in my hand. And those two things were like, it was just kind of a match made in heaven for me, because being in college and needing to maximize my opportunity.
Right.
And then just having close to, I could be 20 minutes from my apartment and hunt. Like that was a really wild concept. So and then that just turned into a pragmatic, I guess, approach of trying to figure out how do you even hunt these deer, because I was failing miserably for the first couple of years trying to even find deer, and being a rifle hunter, thinking long range, trying to get within 30 yards of one of these things was just impossible. So
okay,
that's kind of how it started.
That's so fascinating. And as you're saying this, I'm staring at your background of this buck trailing this doe through the thickest of timber where you could only shoot at about maybe 8 yards of like.
That's about right.
So here I am thinking back to my early days 10 years ago. Tom, it's been a decade since I took my hunter safety course. 10 years. I can't believe I hit that mark. But why that's important is back when I started hunting, I just assumed that if you went into the woods, you'd find animals. Like, you go to the woods, they're everywhere. Not the case. You go to the Midwest or rural areas, and you do see these mule deer all over the place, or you do see these whitetails out in these ag fields. But when it came to blacktail deer, rarely. Like you'd see a doe along a gravel road that had blackberry bushes, strung down the side, or you drive down an apple orchard and you see a deer like munching on apples that are on the ground. But like you said, you'd rarely ever see bucks, even roadkill. Like it was a really fascinating thing. Did my experience of blacktail is that either you're shooting like small forks or they're monsters. I feel like there's no in between. It's a younger like 2-point blacktail, or the big old mature buck that has lived multiple years just in the shadows of the rainforest.
Yeah, I think that it's tough because, in fact, right now as we're talking, the Mule Deer Foundation just started the Blacktail Foundation. It was just recently announced, and the Mule Deer Foundation is actually putting a bunch of money into doing blacktail research, which is really cool for states like Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and California. We've got these deer on the West Coast, and they're often overlooked. So, and they are pretty mysterious. When it comes to age class, I think it's true with any deer species. You're going to see younger class deer more readily during daylight hours. But once that deer, blacktails especially, they get, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 years old, they become a very different nocturnal animal. And I wouldn't say they're nocturnal, meaning they are completely bedded down, during the day and they're not moving. I think that what we perceive as not being nocturnal is the fact that we only see them on cameras at night. Those deer do move during the day. They just have a much more condensed home range, and they use security cover uh, to the best of their ability to avoid human interaction. And they're highly adaptable, like a whitetail. And
Hmm.
every year, if you look at the Midwest and you see these monsters that come out of places like Pike County, Illinois, or Kansas or Iowa. And some of these deer are living in very small woodlots and ditches, and people, they get taken, and people are just freaked out, like, where did this deer come from? And I think if you imagine how thick and the vegetation is out here,
Mm-hmm.
it's really, really easy for these deer to hide and get big. And they don't have the propensity to run great distances when they're spooked because they have so much security cover. A lot of times a mature blacktail will just sit tight and let you walk by and not cause a disruption. So you never knew they were there in the first place.
Uh-huh.
And all you've done is educate them walking in through an area. So I think that I think it's just very difficult to get within bow range of a mature, I would say, uh, you know, a Western Washington, Western Oregon, Columbian blacktail with a
Yeah.
bow, because unless they're conditioned to people or food or something, they're just very secretive animals. And I think when you get into Southern Oregon, Northern California, you're dealing with the same genetic animal, but living adaptively to the different environment that they live in.
Yeah.
People oftentimes online say, well, that looks like a mule deer, or that looks like this. Well, their antler configuration is going to be a little taller, a little wider when they're running around in those oak, grassy, areas that are more open. It's just a sort of a genetic adaptation to where they live.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to see deer more in those open country areas than you will, say, in the thick of uh, Western Washington or Western Oregon.
Yeah. They're blacktail are like the pheasants of the deer population. They just hold tight. You could walk up right up to the bush and kick it, and it might not flush. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. One of the biggest blacktail deer I ever encountered was when I was trail running and training for a 100-mile ultra marathon in Lord Hill Park in Snohomish, in Western Washington, and I was running the single track through the woods and just doing like hairpin turns and all sorts of stuff. And I came around this corner, and this monster 4x4 with eye guards just stood there, broadside at me, looked at me, and just ended up bounding away. And I was like, it actually was during deer season. It was late October,
Wow.
but it was after I didn't have a hunt planned or whatever, and I was like, "Oh, baby, come on now."
And that's just such a rare opportunity. There's only a few days a year that I think that becomes a realistic proposition to be hunting and walk up on a big buck like that,
Yeah,
because um, I don't think they're anywhere by accident, except again when their testosterone's cranking through them and they're looking for hot does, and that's about their only weak link that I can find.
yeah. Okay, so I remember back when we recorded episode 32, and I was talking, I was getting into hunting, and so I was familiar with like hunting slopes, like south facing slopes or north facing
Mhm.
slopes or all this type of stuff. Well, now that I have a better understanding of where these deer hide and what the terrain that they're in, it's a lot like whitetail country where it's not so much topography driven as it is bedding areas, travel corridors, and food sources. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I've written about a lot, I guess more recently for my day job for a, Department of Fish and Wildlife, I've written kind of broken down the months of October, November, and December for big game hunting in Washington. And in those writings, I've tried to simplify this, knowing that, if I'm trying to help a new hunter figure out where to start, it's very simple. You got to have, food, water, and security cover. So no matter what the photography is, no matter what the terrain is, vegetation, um, I'm going to do most of my scouting with that in mind. I'm going to be looking for prime bedding areas, feed areas, and these have to be seasonally considered, right?
Mm.
When in the early bow season, September, and even into really into the middle of October, a lot of the leaves are obviously still on the trees. We don't start losing a lot of big, deciduous leaf drop doesn't happen till like the last couple of weeks of October here. So that coincides with obviously the ramp up of the pre-rut, or the beginning of the pre-rut, and kind of the ramping into the last week. But I will consider all of those things. And really it comes down to travel corridors to and from bedding and feeding areas, and what's the most efficient way a buck can move through an area and scent check as many does as possible with the least amount of energy. So if you kind of approach it from a topography or an aerial imagery standpoint, I'm looking for the path of least resistance that puts me, downwind of bedding areas and provides me the most security cover. And if I can check 3 bedding areas by doing a quarter-mile loop, well, I'm going to do that as opposed to randomly zigzagging across the landscape and checking bedding areas for estrus does.
Right.
So I kind of always approach it that way. Is those primary needs that the animal has, and how to best move between those areas and stay hidden.
Yeah, I talk about that in my 101 series on my website as well. I call it the triangle: food, water, shelter. They have to.
Yep.
They're just constantly right in there, and so
Yep.
if you can put yourself in the center of it, you're gonna be good. I got a lot of questions that just sparked right off of what you said. So you talked about early season when leaves are still on the trees. Obviously, we'll transition into like pre-rut, rut activity, and then once the leaves are off the trees and all that. So my first question is how do you find prime bedding area? So in the whitetail woods, in drawing from whitetail knowledge, you have open landscape and then you have thick cover, and you're like, that's the bedding areas, right? They're bedding in there. They're coming out to ag fields. They're using maybe the creeks in the hardwoods to travel in, and then they're popping out. Western Washington, Western Oregon is just thick. So how do you actually identify what is a bedding area?
That's a great question, and I think it's really easy for people to say, "Oh, find a bedding area and set up close to a bedding area, right, during the rut, or set up downwind of a bedding area." Da 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 da. Well, geez, how do you figure that out? It can be difficult to do. What I generally try to do is do most of my scouting. Like if I have to start from scratch, I don't want to do this during the hunting season because I don't want to start blowing up areas. But after the season's closed and I don't have a valid tag in my pocket, then I'm in research mode. So I will go into bedding areas or find them. And I'm looking for beds, physical beds. I'm looking for high density of pellet counts, droppings. And, and I'm looking for areas adjacent to feed areas that are thicker, usually the upper third of any kind of a ridge or a bench. Bucks will tend to bed just off the crest of a knob where they can use the thermals, and then, they've got escape routes. But it really comes down to putting in the postseason scouting time when all the vegetation is flat, basically. If we get a good snow late in the year, like my favorite is to get like a January snow of 6 or 8 inches, even if it's only a day. If it lasts a day and it's heavy, wet snow, great. What it does is it packs everything down. It pushes the ferns down. It pushes everything down. And then you're able to see the trails. You're able to walk those trails. I turn on my Onyx tracker and I just start walking. And it's crazy. There's one area that I hunted near my house, 1,600-acre area. In one summer, I put out 22 miles on that wildlife area, zigzagging through it, shed hunting, doing all this stuff. Even after 22 miles, boot miles on that wildlife area, I came back and looked at my tracks. There are spots that I completely overlooked, and I thought I covered it well, but that doesn't lie. So bedding areas, back to your question, it really does come down to getting visuals and either seeing deer, bumping deer, or finding beds and pellets.
Okay.
And then I just log those spots and I stay the heck out of them.
You have to journal them. You have to mark them on Onyx and save it. Okay. Don't rely on your memory.
Yep.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Because I felt like I cut you off, and I apologize if I did.
No, I did want to jump back to the food cover water thing, because thermal cover is a concept I really kind of apply from elk hunting, which is in September and it's hot and the elk are going to go bed down. They typically will try to go bed down in big timber where they get that 8-degree temperature drop and thermal cover. It's insulation for them, and the same holds true for deer. So if you're hunting early season deer and you're looking for bedding areas, look for areas on, north slopes that are either in big timber areas or just thickets, right? You can be down in a ravine that's got a cool creek at the bottom. Animals are trying to stay cool too. So consider thermal cover both in the hot weather and in the cold weather. You get a big snow or a deep freeze or a huge cold snap that lasts a week, those deer are going to want to be where they can be under the boughs of a thick cedar tree, or they're going to want to use that vegetation as an insulation blanket the best they can. So just that was the only thing I wanted to throw in there.
Okay, that's awesome, because so the bedding areas. So number one, just to make sure I get you right, you're saying, look, you got to go in there and physically scout because the cover is so thick, and then you have to find the biggest number of droppings. You got to find the most pellets. Like that's ultimately you're in their house.
And I'm thinking about last winter. I was shed hunting, and I love shed hunting, but I'm mostly postseason scouting. And if I find sheds, well, that's great. Tells me where a buck was standing, and I'm definitely going to pay attention to that. But really, what I'm trying to do is log all the rubs from the previous fall, right? All the rut sign that I can. I want to find antlers if I can find them. But mostly what I'm looking for, as I mentioned with the snow, is the trails, because the snow doesn't lie either, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you get a good snow in an area where you don't get a lot of snow, that you can't be sitting at work that day. You got to be out hiking those trails, because that's just invaluable information.
Yeah.
I had a trail, and I think I wrote about it and maybe even have an article about it with a photo of this apple tree that I found out in the middle of nowhere. I see this trail, 2 trails converge, and it turns into this highway of deer tracks. I followed it, and it took me to the spindly little apple tree, and it was still holding apples, even in the dead of winter. And, you mentioned it at the outset, blacktails love apples. Yeah. So it's like if you find a wild apple tree or any kind of I've found cherry trees, any plum trees, anything like that, they will find it, and they'll know where it is, and they will hit it when they need it most.
Yeah,
in the late season. So
when you're walking these trails and you're finding rubs, are these blacktail rubbing these trees in the direction that they're traveling, or on the backside of the trees?
I'd say, rub lines are a funny thing. I found one recently that I wasn't looking for, and it was literally on Scotch broom crossing an entire vacant pasture land. It was like a big clearing that they logged or something. And it was just naturally revegetating with some small trees, but Scotch broom took over, and it was still really sparse, but I was just basically beelining across this opening to get to the timber on the other side. And I happened to see one of the Scotch broom things was all shredded and it was fresh. So I went over, checked it out, and I was like, okay, that's pretty fresh. And then as I was walking, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I could count them for about 100 yards out in front of me. So I think there is some of that, and you can certainly see it on small saplings where you'll see one side of a tree is rubbed, and then if you stop there and look around, sometimes you can pick up another rub. I think direction of travel is one thing, but I think what's most important is that is a travel route, right?
Right.
And a lot of those rubs are there to leave scent. And just yesterday in my stand, I watched a buck using a licking branch, and he used it. A doe came and used it, and then another little spike buck came and used it. And I love those moments where you get to learn by observing deer that are not, my bow was hanging on the hook because I wasn't going to shoot any of these deer, but I use every bit of that information I can for future.
Yeah.
So, travel routes, rub lines, all those things are clues, but I wouldn't like set up and hunt over a rub line. I would use that again, back to Google Earth, back to Onyx, and say, okay, why is that buck traveling this way? Where's he going? Regardless of which side of the tree the rub's on, because he's going to use that trail path in either direction.
Right.
There's a reason the Scotch broom rub line I just found, there's 50,000 ways you could cross that opening, but he was crossing it in that direction, in that angle. And I have another camera that I put on the other end of that. And it's sort of like when I go back and look at that, I see these distant pictures of deer. And that's what they're on that same path.
Cool.
Those. So, I found that rub line by accident, but when I look at my camera footage, it all lines up. Like that's where the deer are traveling.
So are you then, once you are boots on the ground, you're finding these game trails, you're finding the bedding areas, and then are you backtracking and taking a 30,000 foot view look from Onyx and top down being like, okay, this is their corridor, this is where I was walking, this is where bedding areas, and then you're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together? Or, because I always heard one time that blacktail deer don't ever need to drink water, they just get so much moisture from vegetation. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I'd imagine you still want to drink water,
Yeah.
but like so your bedding areas, your travel corridors, and then food source is one of the most crazy things because I feel like it's so abundant in Washington, and you always want to hunt food sources, but how do you go about that hunting blacktail?
Well, I think so. A couple things on the water. I think deer drink several times a day. I typically find that they will drink after eating, after feeding at night. Sometimes they'll drink before they go to bed. I put a man-made water hole on the top of a ridge, try to save deer. There's no water anywhere around this, but in fact, that deer on my website that you were asking me about, I killed that buck at the very top of that ridge. But I had a water hole that I put in there that in the summer, and I kept every time I went into my stand, I'd take water and dump it in there if it needed it. And it wasn't very big, but it was a water source up near a bedding area. And why wouldn't they use that?
Right.
Rather than walk probably over a half mile to the nearest creek if there's even any water in it.
Right.
So, and I had lots of deer using that water hole. So I think they do drink water even when they do get a lot of vegetation, moisture, water off vegetation. They still need to drink. Like, I mean, think about it. Like, there's days where you just want to guzzle a 12-ounce glass of water.
Right.
Like,
Right. I know.
mean,
as I was saying it, it sounded like it doesn't sound as smart as what it was in my head. But
there is a lot of rumors on it, and you don't see a lot of that because, like, well, geez, when's the last time you see a black-tailed deer walk over to a water hole and drink? Like, if I didn't put a camera on a man-made water hole, I never would, to this day, have ever seen that.
Right.
Never seen a deer go to drink. I've seen mule deer go to drink. I've seen whitetails go to drink, but it's more open. Now they can get water out of any little seep or any little creek, and they have their preferred places for it. And that's the same thing with the food source question. They have preferred food sources at all times of the year. Um, when you look at like a logged over area, big leaf maples get cut. The first year after those stumps, those trees are cut, those stumps erupt with new generation. There's bud, the stem count on that is like a porcupine. It's like there's, probably several hundred fresh shoots coming off that stump. Now multiply that times every stump in that clear cut. They're going to go and nip those buds off immediately. Like they love those.
Right.
They love blackberries. They'll eat alder leaves in the fall. I watched two does walking a little 2-track road, and I very carefully was watching what they were eating, and they were picking up fresh green alder leaves that were falling, the yellowish green ones that are starting to fall.
Just straight off the ground.
They must have both eaten 50 leaves.
Huh.
And I when you see that, it's like, okay, I'm taking note of that. I watched one doe, eat holly leaves off a tree. Prickly holly leaves.
Yeah.
So they're going to eat what they eat when they want to eat it.
So targeting food sources for blacktail is like pissing in the wind. Like you never really know what you're going to get type thing, right? Is like,
I don't know if that's a good analogy, because I think you know what you're going to get if you piss in the wind, but depending on which side of the wind which way you're facing.
Yeah, there you go. So
you walked right into that one.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I guess going back to it is, yes, the food, water, shelter, but this goes back to the whole whitetail hunting, where you either want to be in their bedding zones hunting, which is dangerous because you could destroy a bedding zone and then they're gone, or you want to be just on the outside on their travel corridors. Is that more or less your strategies?
Yeah, there's a couple things to that. So I generally, when I suspect, whether I either know or suspect, I have an idea where deer are bedding, and it's not going to be like, oh, they're bedding right there. It's they're bedding in on this hillside, or they're bedding in this flat or this bench, or I think, I have reason to believe there's a bedding area. I'm never going to go in there unless I'm really going to try to push my luck hunting a trail intersection during the pre-rut or something. But what I try to do is hunt the edges of things. I don't like to just plow into the center of my hunting area. I like to leave the best I can control. When you're hunting public land, like a wildlife area, there's someone could ride through there on horses. Like deer are adaptable, and I don't try to get too worked up about that, because just like humans observe, if you observe a really strange person getting on a subway, you're going to take note of that, right? Like they might look dangerous or something off. You can pay attention to that. But if it's just everyday people going to work, you just sort of gloss over. You don't pay attention to it. And I think animals are the same way. They see people doing what they do. They're just not going to get too alarmed about it. But when you start sneaking through the woods and start creeping into their bedding areas, now they feel like they're being hunted, and they're going to change their behavior. So my approach is to leave areas alone the best I can control that. Like if I think that, like some of the areas that I rattle, like if I'm rattling and calling deer, I'm trying to pull animals out of a swamp. I think they're bedded near the edge of the swamp. I'm not going to go plowing through there. I'm going to leave that alone. Never going to go in there. I might go in there in the off season, but usually it's full of water at that point, and difficult to do. But generally I stay off to the sides, downwind, and I'm really particular about not tromping through an area just because, right? I'm in a more surgical approach to it than I do some in-season scouting, where, especially if I'm on public land and I'm like, well, okay, I've always wanted to go up on that ridge, or I've always wanted to go check out that draw. I might carefully move into that spot. And if I blow something up, okay, well, I'm going to take note of it and move on. But if I knew that I saw a big buck use an intersection at the bottom of a ridge or something like that, I'm not going to go in there and poke around with it. I'm not going to put a camera in there. I'm going to hunt it by faith, knowing that, kind of like bass fishing, if a big buck is using that area, just like a big bass, you catch a big bass out from under a piece of structure or a log, another one's going to be in there. Um, big bucks like what big bucks like. And so I would hunt those areas on faith and not, take the risk of scenting up the area or intruding.
That's interesting. That's what Robbie Denning says about mule deer. He says you find an area that holds a monster 200-inch buck and you kill it. He goes, you go back there the next year, there will be a big old deer sitting right in that area.
I 100% believe that. And I sort of learned that bass fishing, as I mentioned, in high school. I was pretty serious bass fisherman. I was like, every year I could go to the same spots and hook nice fish, and I feel like there's a reason a 6-pound largemouth wants to be where they are. And I think, you get past 3.5 years old on a public land blacktail, 4.5, 5.5. It's this, I hate even saying this because it's such a cliche, but they don't get that old traipsing around clear cuts in broad daylight in October. They get shot. Right. So when you find places that hold big deer, those are special places, and I generally don't go into them. I just know that until they get logged, or until a house gets developed or built, or a road gets cut in, I'm going to bank on that spot being good every year and not even scout it. Just going to hunt it.
Gotcha.
Only when the conditions are right.
All right, so let's talk about hunting and bedding areas and these travel corridors. So I feel like there's two different types of blacktail hunting. You got clear-cut blacktail hunting and logging roads, and then you got like the actual thick timber where it might be a single track that's a hiking trail through, thick brush. Are you hunting those the exact same, or are they completely different strategies?
Kind of different. I've spent a lot of time hunting public land, big timber tracks, big logging units, and I love a good clear cut. I love getting up in a stand and glassing and trying to locate bucks and where they're coming from. That's kind of my strategy, I guess, is in the summer, late September. I generally like to be elk hunting, but if I'm not elk hunting and I'm going to do some scouting, I'm going to put a stand up, and all I'm going to do is watch. After work, drive 20, 30 minutes, whatever, do a big logging clear cut, climb up in my stand and just, pencil out deer. Like, where are they at? Where are they coming from? What are they feeding? That doesn't tell me what I'm going to do in October. It just tells me what bucks are in the area and, how I might hunt that. Maybe it's the next ridge over, maybe it's getting down into the bottoms in some of those trail systems. But I think the other thing to consider is, I'm primarily bow hunting. Well, I am bow hunting.
Right.
So I look at big country differently. I look at it at the macro level, like I just described, like, okay, what deer on the landscape? But then I really narrow down, like, where am I actually going to hang a stand? Where am I going to saddle hunt, or where am I going to put up a ground blind? Because I've packed ground blinds in the public land and set them up where there's not a good tree situation. Sometimes a brushed in blind in the bottom of a ravine is the best you're going to be able to do. So I think it's about being adaptable, but letting the terrain and the deer movement kind of dictate what approach that you take.
Interesting. When you're packing in the blind, are you leaving it there, or is it for the
Yeah.
day? Okay. So that the deer get used to it, or does that ever cross your mind?
It doesn't. I mean, there's a back in the day. Now I'm really dating myself. I guess it was probably the early '90s when the double bull blind came out. Brooks Johnson and Keith Beam came up with this pop-up ground blind, which was actually just ripped off idea from these manhole cover pop-up blinds that you see, or pop-up things.
Yeah.
They're like, hey man, that would be a cool hunting blind. And they put camo fabric on it and launched a great company. But in talking to those guys back then in Colorado, um, they had this 50, they call it the 50-100 rule. And basically that's what I follow. And I think it's pretty great advice for deer hunting in blinds. If a deer is going to first see that blind within 50 yards, you brush it in, like really brush it in, like make sure it's tucked under a tree, pushed back into a thicket, the front's covered up. Like you really want to make it blend in. If the deer are going to see it within 100 yards, then that's not going to typically spook them.
Huh.
They're going to see. So they had this funny rule, and I've tried it. Like with turkeys, it doesn't care. I mean, I see turkeys moving through a little swale, and I'm 100 yards away watching them go through the swale 3 times a day. You can bet your butt next morning my blind's be right in that swale, and I'm going to kill turkeys. They don't care.
Yeah.
But deer care. I haven't really had any deer spook from a blind.
Interesting.
Following that rule,
yeah.
Never.
So this,
I've had them. Let me one more thing.
Oh,
I've literally heard hooves in the leaves. I set up on you know what I'm talking about when I say like a 2-track alder choked logging road.
Yep.
Grown over, not been used for years, and the whole road base is green grass and alder leaves and maple leaves. I could hear hooves walking, and I had a deer walk like 2 feet past my window, just passing through. Never even missed a beat, never slowed down, just a steady walk. And I could have stuck it in the rib cage with an arrow out the window, you know? So I believe that brushing in is a big deal when it's going to be something that could startle them.
Well, so what I was going to say is from my experience of whitetail hunting, because I've been hunting the last 2 years out of a ground blind, and I realized everyone's like, oh man, you got to brush it in. You got to brush it in. I'm like, well, I understand, but where I was, there wasn't a whole lot of brush that I could have like truly grabbed to brush it in. So I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know. I guess I'll just see how the cards fall. And this year I arrowed my very first buck out of my ground blind, and that you could see that deer from 100 yards or maybe, like 85 yards. But but that's the thing. And then it ended up just, coming over and never was spooked. I arrowed my deer. So, but that kind of goes to prove your point of 50, 100.
Well, you just look at how jumpy they can be. If you come out into the field on a trail every day and all of a sudden one day you come out and there's this big blob, and you're going to be taken aback by that a little bit.
Yeah.
But if it's tucked in under a tree or it's, it's kind of like you can go overkill, right? It doesn't have to be completely invisible, but I think that being aware that you don't want to startle deer, and there's nothing that'll screw up a hunt more than a very curious and agitated mature doe, right? Like a doe starts stomping her foot and blowing at this stupid blind, you're done. Like,
right.
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh. Okay, so let's dial this in a hair more on the bedding areas, travel corridors. So you are identifying travel corridors based off of bedding areas, and then you prefer to hunt from a tree because that provides you the most opportunity, is what you're saying. Okay.
Most of the time.
And how many stands are you hanging for a year? Are you hanging an early season stand and then knowing that that's not what you're going to be hunting in the later season, or how do you go about that?
It just depends on the area. Like there's some spots where right now I have I'm hunting about 300 acres, but I only have access to 40. And I have 5 ground blinds and 2 tree stands, and I have a couple trees set up for saddle, like recon. So, okay. But that one's kind of interesting because it's somewhat of a private land situation. Some of it it's a piece of public that's landlocked, and so the public, I've never seen anyone in there. But that being said, like if I'm hunting public land, I have one of the original lone wolf alpha hang on stands. That's my go-to tree stand that I'll just put it on my pack and I'll just hunt with that on my back and, and kind of find a good spot. I'm going to set up on it.
Nice. Nice. All right. So this year, I really took to rattling for deer. Archery season down here in Texas opens the last weekend of September and it runs all the way through October. And then the first weekend in November is rifle season. So you actually get to hunt deer in the rut with a rifle if you want. Obviously, the full time archers they love chasing deer with bows, but my diving into all this was, when do you start rattling? Am I just paying attention to social media and seeing when people are starting to post
Yeah.
videos of rattling antlers or all this? Well, I specifically decided around the 15th of October was when I was going to start rattling for
Yeah.
whitetail for pre-rut. Obviously, I live in Texas now. We're talking the West Coast, Pacific Northwest. Is that about the same time that you're starting to kick off that pre-rut?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I've always said the 15th is like I wouldn't be rattling any sooner than that. And there is certainly sparring that's happening, but it depends on what you define as rattling. Like if I'm just using the antlers, I'm going to be pretty light tickling of antlers, more social, um, pecking order stuff that's usually just kind of a reinforcement of what we might already know between us as deer, right? Like, okay, I'm going to engage in this little sparring session with you, but you know that I'm top dog here.
Yeah.
So it's not a fight; it's more of just that social sparring. I'll start that, yeah, middle of October, 18th, maybe 20th. But yeah, you get into the later part. I'd say the last week in October is go time, obviously, through the first, through peak breeding, November 12th ish up here. Rattling can work anytime there. I will say that way back when I was in college, just for an experiment, I rattled I was lucky because the first time I tried rattling a deer, I was with my buddy Mark, and we went into this piece of prime looking private land. It was owned by a timber company.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we had permission or not. I don't remember. I think we just hunted it. But we went in there and I started rattling and I rattled in this big old 4-point, just came cruising in the rain and Mark missed him. Rattled again. He ran down in this draw. I rattled again and beaten on the brush. And here he comes. He circled around behind me. He never got a shot at him, but he was just keyed in. So that was the first year I ever tried rattling. Well, like the next summer, I saw some deer feeding, full velvet.
Mm-hmm.
And I rattled. I had my antlers. I was rattling. I called a 3-point. I got photos of this 3-point coming into about 10 feet to my rattling. So I think that the whole point of that is I think that, deer are curious. Like, was he coming to the sound of rattling or was he just coming because he heard this weird sound
Right.
and didn't know what it was? Like, I don't know. But I think that when you're rattling deer, you're generally going to be pulling in a lot of the younger bucks, 2.5, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5-year-old bucks are generally what I've called in. I think almost every buck I've shot rattling, maybe with the exception of one or two, has been a fork. And some of them have been bigger forks. Just genetically around where I live, I don't have, it's not like Western Oregon where I used to live where, geez, you'd see a lot of bigger framed bucks than I see here in Washington where I hunt.
Yeah.
But that being said, most of the deer that I've killed are 2.5, 3.5-year-old from rattling. I've never called in a big old masher and got a shot at it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So are you, man, that really changes, I guess, the questions I was going to ask is if you are you're rattling in bucks, calling them in, they're younger, then is that based off of a playful rattle or a rattling sequence of aggressive? Like this year, In the whitetail woods for me, I was rattling for 2 to 3 minutes every 15 minutes. Now that was just getting at it, rest, 15 minutes, going right back at it. Or even 3 to 5 minutes with a 15-minute break. Are you following a pattern, or is it more just instinctual and kind of whatever you're feeling at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I made a video, a rattling fundamentals video for Blacktails on my YouTube channel, but it kind of goes through my whole set series or how I do it. But again, I think the key with it is you have to consider, like, what are you trying to emulate? It's kind of like if you think about calling elk, and people have all these scenarios that they try to replicate. I'm cow calling, and then 10 minutes later, this bull comes in and starts trying to call the cow away, and all, and then there's this raking that's happening, and it's the same thing when you're calling deer. So I'm first going to maybe start with some soft doe bleats, because if there's a deer close, I want to try to get a reaction with the least amount of noise or the least amount of calling I can. I'll let that sit for 15 minutes or so. And then in my scenario, well, what if a buck did come in? What if 2 bucks came in? What if they start squaring off and this doe is, and again, this is late October. So, you're playing into the hormones, and you're also playing into the fear of missing out. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
by starting a rattling sequence or a 2 bucks coming together fighting over a doe, now that signifies that, okay, maybe there's a hot doe and I should go investigate that. But a lot of times I'm doing a lot more pushing with the antlers. I'm not doing a lot of loud clanking. It's kind of like a coming together, some aggressive shuffling. I grind the bases together. If I'm on the ground, I do a lot of brush thrashing, and because that's what you hear most. It's not the clatter of the antlers you're hearing, it's the shoving, especially with the salal and the ferns. I've seen a couple buck fights, and I'm not hearing antlers. What I'm hearing is, it sounds like 2 sumo wrestlers rolling down a hill. Like, it's just
right.
It's thrashing. So I try to do as much of that as I can. If I'm in a tree stand, sometimes I'll jig my antlers off the tree with my pull-up rope and clank them together off the ground and in the ferns, and slam them, around in the ground as best I can. It also helps keep the sound down low, which is kind of nice. But basically I do a session, and then I wait. I'll do, my sessions are probably a minute to a minute and a half. And in the scenario, it's 2 bucks came together. They sorted out their difference. They come apart. I might throw in a couple soft grunts, and then I'm going to wait like half an hour.
Okay.
And then if nothing happens, I usually hit it hard at that point and have a little drawn out sequence, maybe up to 2-3 minutes. And again, I like to be on the ground, because then I can really stomp my feet. I can, with the base of the antlers, I can pound them into the ground, and it can really emulate the sound of hooves and other sounds, which I think are more realistic. And then I'm going to wait 45 minutes after that next one. And that's kind of it for me.
Okay. So I mean, that's some pretty good strategy. So if I'm somebody in the state of Washington and it's rifle season, it's October, Blacktail, you can hunt all the way typically through the 31st in the state of Washington. You recommend carrying something that you can rattle with, or a doe bleat, like one of those cans, and
yeah. Sorry.
No, jump in. Yeah.
No, I think, for me, I've never rifle hunted blacktails. So but if it was me and I had a 30-30 or 30-06 or 270 on my back, I would have a set of rattling antlers. I would be covering ground, and I would be setting up downwind of, spots that look good, big timber stands, benches, and I would be rattling. and I would be, get a shooting sticks or something where you can get a good rest. I'd be rattling. I'd be kind of run and gun. Like I wouldn't give it tons of time because I would be looking for the one that wants to play, just like elk. Because if I can shoot 70, 80, 100 yards, dude, that's a game changer.
Right. Right.
Trying to pull a buck inside 30 and have a clear shot. That's a whole nother level of challenge.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So one of the questions is elk and blacktail deer. You'll find what is it? I forget. Is it mule deer that don't mind elk, or is it whitetail deer that don't mind elk? I forget what type of deer it is that they'll co-mingle with elk in the area, but one of them doesn't want anything to do with elk around them. Blacktail share a lot of the same habitat as Roosevelt's. So when you are targeting blacktail, are they where the elk are? Or are you finding elk where you're targeting blacktail deer? Or are you cross training and using those to play off of each other?
Well, generally, it's kind of funny how I've noticed this over the years. But do you ever notice, and maybe you notice this too, because you've done some bear hunting up here, but
Yeah.
do you ever notice that when you go into the field, you're going to the same places, but today you're bear hunting, you actually see bears.
Yes.
And when you're elk hunting, you find elk. It's kind of a weird scenario, but I think the last elk I shot in Oregon, I had to wait for a blacktail to get out of the way so I could shoot it. So they were feeding literally side by side, like a doe and a fawn, and it was a 4-point bull and I think a doe or a 4-corn buck. I can't remember. It was a long time ago, but I was like, "God, get out the hell out of the way! I'm trying to draw my bow."
Okay, so that's great, and that's great advice for all the people that want to go pursue whether it's blacktail or Roosevelt's. Is if you're an archery hunter, make sure you have both those tags in your pocket at the same time.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Are those bedding areas going to be in the same spot typically as well?
No, I think that elk move around a bit. Roosevelt elk are not as migratory, I guess, in nature as a Rocky Mountain elk in a daily routine. But elk are going to have their bedding areas that they like. They like more flat areas where deer will tuck in on a steep hillside behind a stump. Or I don't know. I think it's a function of the number of animals that are together when they bed. Deer, it's 1s and 2s and 3s and they spread out a little bit. But for elk, if you got a 7 or 8 or a dozen head of elk, they're going to go find a place where they can spread out and bed down and be comfortable. So
interesting. Okay,
yeah.
so one of the things I heard about mule deer hunting is this whole idea that a mule deer, when you spook it or it runs off, it does a J hook. It'll run and then it'll end up like trying to loop back either one direction or the other. Or do you find that to be true with blacktail as well? And then if one does spook and you're like, oh, dude, that was a shooter, are you going to slowly put a stock on it and just kind of pick one lane or the other and hope that you run into it again? Or
I don't think it's an absolute, but I've absolutely had that happen. And I think they do tend to watch their back trail. So they might move out in front and then they J hook a little bit and they'll stop and watch or get the wind right. But I think one of my number one most broken rules that if I was telling a new hunter, I would tell them, if you spook a deer, get where you can shoot and just sit there for 30 minutes.
Oh,
because a lot of times they come back, they're curious and they want to know if you're gone, but they just got to get in bow range.
You're right.
Right. And I'll let them know.
That is awesome. Are you hunting these deer any differently from September to November? And then even archery season is still open, right, in the state of Washington?
Yeah. Yes.
So
I'm still working on it.
Once these leaves are falling off the ground, off the trees and hitting the ground, is your strategy changing at all?
Yeah, it is. And it's shifting food sources. It's also shifting sort of physiological changes, right? After the peak breeding, they will breed all the way through December. I mean, I watched a spike buck run a little yearling fawn around for half an hour 2 nights ago, Saturday night. And she'd stop and pee, and he'd go over there and sniff and lip curl. And I was like, okay, well, they're either playing, like, just running through the motions, or that fawn is potentially coming to estrus. And so, they're, I'm, I'm still, it's game on for me. Like, that could pull another buck back into that spot.
Uh-huh.
So, but generally speaking, back to your question, I'm going to be shifting to hunt food destination locations, food sources. I don't think that you're going to see a lot of just daytime random activity. I've had better luck though calling in December, oftentimes mid-December, because of that mid-December second rut activity. I think I tagged 3 deer on December 31st in a row, which was kind of a weird little streak.
Oh, wow.
And one of those deer, I was field dressing my buck, and I heard a buck fight 100 yards away that was just knocked down, drag out. I literally hiked back out and got my big mag light from my truck because I was hoping I was going to try to sneak over there and try to see him because I could hear him just going to town.
Wow.
I never got close enough to him, but yeah, December can be a really, I hunt food sources, but I mean, you can have, depending on the doe situation and the yearlings and does that were bred or yearlings that hadn't been bred or coming into estrus late in December, you can have a second rut action that's better than the primary rut.
What are the food sources in late November, December?
I watch deer constantly, and the other night, well, 2 nights ago and last night, I watched deer just browsing on grasses and some random weeds and plants that were coming up. I could hear them literally tearing the plants out like elk tearing on grass. They were also bickering over some, I don't know what they were, some kind of little crab apples or something.
Yeah.
I don't know what this tree is. I think it's from an old, I don't even know what it is, but some kind of a mast.
Yeah.
But it didn't look native to me. But at the end of the day, blackberries, late season, they'll eat the blackberry leaves.
Right.
They're browsers, and they'll go for those. You'll get, regeneration of big leaf maples. Anytime there's been logging activity, it doesn't take spring to cause those stumps to start regenerating shoots, and they'll just key in on any of the buds that they can find. And of course, any other natural attractants like wild apples. That's why you'll see them, at a fire station where it has an apple tree on the side of the fire station. You'll see deer at night, eating those apples.
I targeted this year. I wanted to understand whitetail deer a little bit more, and so obviously here in Texas we have corn feeders, right? It's like you have a corn feeder because you need a corn feeder in order to pull these deer from these different areas to where you want to be able to hunt them at. The issue is that those corn feeders are great in the summer when everything's dry and there's no really good food source. But as soon as that temperature drops just enough and those acorns, depending on who we're talking to and where we're from. That's right. As soon as those hit, your corn is like it's untouched. Is there anything like that in the Northwest that you could be like, that's what you got to hunt?
Again, aside from we keep talking about apples, but I mean, I could literally put half a dozen apples in my backyard right now, and by morning they'll be gone. Like nothing attracts blacktails like apples in the fall. But that being said, there's not apple trees all over Western Washington, especially in the mountains, and the hills, and all the different places they live. So they're just going to focus on the highest calorie food that's available. They'll eat. Gosh, they just eat a lot of buds. They do a lot of browsing, obviously, in the winter because they don't have the leaves, but they do vacuum up those alder leaves, lichens, blackberries, a lot of the berries, right? All the buds on huckleberries, red huckleberries. Um, I don't see them eating Oregon grape. I don't, not to say they don't, but I did find a list of published foods, native foods that blacktails prefer, and it was like 50 or 60 or even more species of plants. So I
It's hard. It's
can't
hard to
begin to,
target it. Yeah.
yeah. The way I've always described it is that they live in a salad bowl here.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you like spinach, they're going to pick out the spinach leaves. If you like arugula, they're going to pick out the arugula leaves. Like they're going to just move through the landscape and eat what's their preference in that moment. Um, and I think it depends on what their dietary needs are on any particular day or week or
Yeah.
month. As they move through the area. But bucks lose a lot of calories. They lose a lot of weight during a rut, and so my strategy for late season blacktail hunting is they're going to bed as close to good food as they can, and that's why human intrusion for me is so damn important, not to penetrate those areas and again hunt them on faith, knowing that okay, they're going to want to travel the least amount from bedding to food, and they're going to want to stay in thick cover. So I'm going to approach downwind, I'm going to set up, and I'm only going to hunt those spots when I have good wind and or when I can approach without being seen
Interesting.
or heard.
Okay, so then are you not ever still hunting with the arrow knocked, just slowly moving through the woods off of a trail?
No, the only time I've knocked an arrow is when I've either like seen a deer, like see a deer's ear flick or something, and I see a doe feeding at 100 yards through the big timber.
Mm-hmm.
Then I might knock an arrow and might move that way. But when I do still hunt quite a bit, but it's rarely with an arrow knock, mainly because I don't want to have to manage that damn thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting hung up on everything and getting pulled off your rest, or you know yeah, there's a safety aspect of it, but to be perfectly frank, it's not the safety I'm concerned about when I'm moving that slow. It's trying to navigate through all the brush with a 20 some inch arrow sticking out the front of my bow.
Right. Right.
I need to be able to move through an area quietly and keep that bow low to the ground, and just if I need to pull it in tight to my chest or something like that, like once I have good reason to stop and knock an arrow, um, that's when I put an arrow on a string.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
I
sense.
love still hunting. It's one of my favorite ways to hunt. It's just it's not something that I just don't have as many days a year to hunt is to make it conducive for me to use that for my time. Like
Yeah.
I'm gonna put more of my effort into precise locations where I believe I'm gonna have a highest odds of, if I'm moving, then deer are much better at seeing movement than I am. So either I'm moving or they're moving. So I would rather they be the ones moving and me being stationary. And
You make a great point right there. I
you know,
I like that. I like that. So when you are hunting, what I'm gathering is that you hunt blacktail a lot like whitetail, where it's like, hey, I got a couple hours in the morning, or I got a couple hours in the evening, and I'm able to
mm-mm.
squeak out and do that. Is is that what you are getting at? And then do you see more deer movement in the mornings or in the evenings, or does it even matter?
So first question, I have think of it like a rings of an archery target.
Yep.
If the center is close to home, I have a half a dozen of those spots, and then an hour away I've got 4 or 5 spots, and then 2 hours away I've got 2 spots.
Yeah.
And on a weekend where I can spend a day, I'm going to take a drive and go see some new country. But when I've got you know early season, you get off work at 5 and it's light till 9:30, you can get 4 hours sitting in a tree stand.
It's pretty good.
Like I've shot blacktails doing that. Shot my first buck with my homemade recurve back in like 98, after work. Climbed a tree, boom, deer on the ground. Like I'm going to take advantage of that. But it, and that was on, big public land DNR tract. But what was your second question?
Well,
Oh,
the whole hunting just for a few hours, but then are you seeing more deer movement in the mornings or in the evenings?
It depends on what's happening. I generally in October, I generally don't hunt mornings. I like to hunt evenings, but in as we get into November, I like to get out and do those morning sits. I think 8:30 to 9:30 or 10 in the morning. I've seen some good buck activity.
Hmm.
Mid morning cruisers. Um, I love evening hunts for a couple reasons. If I'm in big public land area, sometimes I like to just go and get to where I want to find. I basically go get to my spot, hang my stand, and hunt till dark. And then if it's really good and I'm feel good about the spot, I might even leave my stand. We can do that in Washington. Some states you can't. It's illegal to leave a stand or steps or anything. Um, or I'll just pull my stand down and hike out in the dark. And then, the next day is another day. Um, it just depends.
Mm. Yeah, that's
I think
interesting.
I think that I would sum it up by being adaptable. Like the conditions are always what's going to drive me. I have in in my truck, I have 3 tree stands. I've got ladders, like climbing sticks, like 3 or 4 sets. I've got my saddle. I've got screw-in steps. I've got a whole tote of mobile hunting gear. You know, and and basically what I decide to do when I get there is what I end up doing sometimes.
Mm.
Unless I'm in one of these smaller pieces where I'm hunting a 40-acre hunk of land, 20 minutes from my house or 15 minutes away. Um, but what I'm doing there is also managing expectations too, right? Like you don't have all day. So like now I'm getting down to the end of December. I've got 4 Pope and Young class shooter bucks that I've been trying to get, since October. But at the end of the day, I'm going to put a deer in the freezer. Like
Hmm.
I only got a couple of weeks left. And, I'm just going to go to the end and I'll shoot a doe or a small buck or whatever and fill my tag and be happy with that. And next year's a new season. So,
Yeah, yeah. How many? We covered this a little bit at the beginning, saying if you find a spot that holds a big deer and you take it out,
yeah.
another big deer will find that spot. Are you finding that in these areas that are holding like 2.5, 3.5 year old deer consistently, that they're consistently holding 2.5 and 3.5 year old deer, or do you find old crusty that ends up rolling through there at some time?
That's an interesting question because I actually see a mix of age classes. When I think about that real time, the spot I'm hunting right now, I've got, like I said, 4 Pope and Young class bucks. One wouldn't make the book because it's a non-typical and it's goofy, but it's a 4.5-year-old deer. Um, but I've also got, I think, 3 or 4 fork horns.
Mhm.
One's a 3x2 and a couple little crab claw 3x3s and like 3 spikes.
Huh.
They're all using this throughout. Like I pull up my Moultrie mobile app and scroll through that. I could send you a screenshot and you're going to see a mixed bag of does, fawns, and every age class.
Mm,
And that's just what I've noticed.
yeah. Are you ever hunting does to hunt the bucks? Or are you more
Yes.
just hunting black-tailed deer because they're hard to find?
Well, I first and foremost, I'm a meat hunter. Like I want to fill my tags. I love black-tail deer meat. I love making sausage and pepperoni and jerky and giving it away to my friends and family. And I just love blacktail. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm always going to tag a deer if I can. But that being said, it's beginning of the season, the bar is pretty high. I've got some deer that I'm trying to kill, and it takes me sometimes 2 or 3 years before I can get a crack at them. But um, at the end of the day, the bar gets lower as the days run out. So the hourglass runs out of sand. It's
I would
it's time to put some meat in the freezer.
I went up to
Uh,
Nebraska here recently and did a rifle hunt, and it was with Hornady ammunition, which
yep,
they're cool people. And
yeah,
I showed up. I was like, okay, it's a 3-day hunt. Like it's not that
yep,
much time. I also drove all the way up here. I'd like to return home with meat.
yep.
What type of deer am I good to shoot? And the thing was like, well, because we're filming it for media stuff. We loved a TV quality deer. I'm like, okay,
Yeah, yeah,
I get that. Also, I'm hunting, a ranch or a farm, and so there's also the landowner who wants to see a certain type or class deer shot. But then at the
right.
same time, I'm like, dude, okay, it's last morning. Okay, like time is. Am I gonna can I shoot a
Yeah,
doe? Are we good? It's really interesting that how that pressure gets applied, and
yeah,
it's like I meat crisis, baby. I really wanted to make sure I
yeah.
brought some meat home.
Well, I'm gonna throw something out here that people are gonna probably talk about the next day at work after listening to this yahoo that was on your podcast. I drew Kansas the first year they allowed non-residents to hunt Kansas.
Really?
I hunted the entire season, and I had a couple opportunities, close calls on some big Kansas bucks.
Uh huh.
And the next day we were leaving for Illinois, and I shot a spike on the last morning. The only spike I'd ever killed in Kansas.
Yeah, but the body on that spike was probably monstrous.
Yeah, yeah, they were 42-inch spikes. No, they were 4-inch spikes.
Oh man.
But again, like I love deer meat, man. To get a nice Midwest whitetail when you grow up out here and you don't get that very often, dang right, I was going to fill my tag,
Yeah.
because we were leaving,
Yep.
and I said, the next day, the day before, I had a nice, 110-inch 9-pointer come by my tree, and I let him walk, and at the end of the day, it's deer hunting. I get a little funny about all the focus on big antlers and scores and all that. I've been a Pope and Young measurer for a long time.
Uh huh.
I love record programs for what they are. I think they put credit where it deserves, is on the animal and the genetics and the conservation story around keeping those records. But at the end of the day, we're deer hunters, we're elk hunters, and let's just go in the field. Every hunt is your own hunt.
Yeah.
Have the hunt you want to have, fill your tag. It's your tag, it's your money, it's your trip, it's your gas, it's your freezer,
Yeah.
it's your dinner table. Don't apologize. Go hunting,
Yep.
fill tags.
Yes, dude. I preach it, brother. I'm all about hunt your hunt.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, when you were saying, yeah, first year ever hunting Kansas, and last day I wanted to fill my tag, I shot a spike. Well, you're darn right. How much money did it cost to go out there just to even hunt those deer? For that
Yeah,
amount of time. It's like, yeah, I wanted to take home a little something for my
yeah,
efforts.
yeah. And that was a hunt with, some big name dudes from Bowhunter magazine. It was a kind of a cool deal. We were writing an article on it. None of that mattered to me. What mattered to me was like, I want to fill my tag.
Yeah, dude.
So
Absolutely. Okay, so one last question, and this is a
sure.
topic that I'm not familiar with since leaving the state of Washington, and I don't know what Oregon's like either. Baiting. Uh, do you do it? Do you prefer to do it? If you could do it, would you? What What's your
It's legal.
protocol on that?
Yeah, so baiting's legal. I don't have any problem. I think, we put bait on hooks. We use decoys for ducks. We use calls. We rattling. It's a food source.
Right.
Yes, you might put it there. I don't, I think, ethics are what they are. If people don't want to bait, they don't think it's right, don't do it. But
Hmm.
if it's legal in your state and you want to, go ahead. I'm not a big bait person. That said, I'm set up on a friggin' apple tree. So,
Right.
I'm not going to sit here and call the kettle black because I don't pour bait on the ground. I'm hunting over a natural food source that I know is going to get attention all the way into December.
Yeah.
And it is. Until every last apple is gone off that tree, there will be deer visiting that tree.
Yeah.
Just the way it works.
Have you ever used bait for your benefit when it comes to blacktail hunting?
I've put out apples in front of cameras, mainly to stop animals or even to see what might be in the area because they're going to find them. And they're everywhere, right? You can drive around in the summer and pick up apples on the side of the road in a ditch. You can pick throw a dozen in your backpack, go in there and dump them out. They're gonna be on them within a day.
Hmm.
Or the raccoons or possums or whatever. But I'm not a big bait person. I've done some bear baiting in the past up in Canada, and I did some in Oregon. That's a lot of work, and I
Yeah.
think when you condition deer to placed bait by a human, you actually are conditioning them to not have to work for food, which I think can actually work against you in the end, because you might be getting cool pictures at night, but if these deer know that they have a predictable place to eat and they don't have to bed very far away and they can just come at night and eat because every day you keep putting more food on the ground, I don't think it hurts the deer, but I think it hurts your chances of them ever coming around during the daytime because they don't have to.
Right.
Right. So I think it's a slippery slope of relying on something that might actually be hurting your odds.
That's an interesting perspective. I'm gonna have to chew on that. I do agree, and I'm just trying to take what I know from whitetail woods and corn feeders, and like
Yeah.
how do deer
Well, and
respond to that?
I think that I apply kind of the way I hunt turkeys. I want to be where turkeys want to be.
Mm,
That's where I want to set up. Like, okay, you find a roost tree, you set up off a roost tree. I'm the king of setting up where it looks like they're going to fly down, but they always go the other direction. It's just the way it works. I
yeah.
mean, and I've even done it where I literally say, okay, here's where we're going to set up. And then in the dark, I say, nope, we're going to go over to this other spot because this is where I was going to set up. And because they always go to the opposite area, we're going to go to that opposite area. In the last minute, we're going to trick the world forces that cause deer to or
Mm,
turkeys to avoid me. Never works. So, but what I do try to do is I observe turkeys during the day, where they're feeding, what time of day they're in certain parts of a field or whatever. And if you just get where turkeys want to be, turkey hunting gets a lot easier
mm,
than trying to chase them down. And sure, mountain birds are fun. Miriam's up there in Northeast Washington. It's run and gun. It's like elk hunting. You're climbing hills. You're locating. That's a hoot. I love doing that too. But when it comes to deer hunting, I'm gonna want to. I personally don't want them to know I'm there, and I want to be between where they want to be going to or from
yeah. Yeah. Uh,
during legal shooting light. That's my goal.
Man, that makes sense. Well, let's wrap it up with this because I'm a huge Onyx guy. I know you are as well. And if somebody you already mentioned boots on the ground. Like you have to go in there and physically scout.
Yeah.
You have to find the bedding areas. When it comes to scouting, um, like envisions a spot that you have in your head that you maybe haven't been to, or you want to, or you know
hmm
what are the steps? What are you looking for when it comes to scouting for blacktail deer?
So I think we should do another podcast on this because I mentor about 10 to 12, 8 to 12 people a year using Onyx in
Uh-huh.
other states and here in Washington. And I have this so perfected that I'm literally mentoring people I've never met out of state to their first big game animals using Onyx.
Awesome.
And and so to try to answer your question, the way I do that is if you and I right now were, if I didn't know you,
Hmm.
I would say, drop me a pin of where you're hunting, basically. And of course, I'm not going there. I'm not sharing. This is all confidential, right? It's a trust thing. But then I do my own scouting on Onyx at home. And I tell them where I'd put cameras, tell them where I'd hike, and then I just send them on a mission. And then we get back on the phone or on Teams or Zoom or whatever, and we talk through it. They tell me what they saw, and then I dial it in. I keep dialing it in, keep dialing. And I'd say, put a stand there. I'd put a camera here. I would do this. I would enter from this bottom, do this, do that. One guy in California, it took us 3 years, and he finally killed this buck. And it
Mm.
was like when I was at work and I get a text message from this random number in California, and I saw the pictures, I was like, oh my God, it worked. Like,
That's awesome.
but I think that there's a lot to that, right? There's topography, there's uh access. Those are the key points. You gotta figure out how you're gonna hunt an area. You gotta look at the terrain features. You gotta get in there on the boots on the ground. And until you do those things, it's really hard to help somebody.
Mm.
I've looked at tons of Google Earth imagery, but that's great. It gives you another layer of perspective to look at. But there's a guy in Oregon I've been helping, and he owns this huge kind of ranch, and he's got elk all over it, and he hasn't been able to kill an elk. So I've been trying to help him dissect his property and think like an elk, and quit trying to hunt every bit of your 400 acres. You only need to hunt 20.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you know,
Is there any key feature? Like if you could say, hey, target this when you're e-scouting. Like for example, for bears, it's south facing slopes and find a creek because they
yeah,
use that
it's
as a highway. Like that's
yeah.
their travel corridor. Is there anything like that that you can say for blacktail?
I would say it depends on how far north you are. If you're in Washington, Western Washington, Olympic Peninsula, Western Oregon, in the thick stuff, I would say it's difficult to do that.
Okay.
I think when you get into, midway down to Oregon, Springfield south, then you start getting into oaks and different habitats. And I think then you can start thinking more like a whitetail hunter, even, and looking at those brushy draws, looking at water sources, because in that drier climate, they're going to want to have access to regular water.
Right.
I just approach it based on the habitat they live in. But up here, no, I guess it's not the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is mixed vegetation. I want to see riparian forest kind of, I want those lush bottoms. I want alder, um, big leaf maple, vine maple, and a mix of hemlock, fir, and Doug fir stands and big timber with ferns. I want all of that classic Pacific Northwest thick habitat that's adjacent to good food sources like clear cuts or crop fields down in the bottom. Those all the edges. Blacktails love edges. So if you can find, and they're everywhere. If you focus, I should say, on edges and edge habitat with the things I just mentioned, you're going to find deer.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's the recipe.
Okay. So I remember reading a book, or I forget what it was. They said whenever like you find a clear cut, go to the edge of the clear cut and then walk 15 feet to 15 yards inside the timber from the cut, and then walk that as your boundary, and then you'll start picking up deer sign, and then that will dictate a lot for you. Is that you familiar with that?
Um, I haven't heard that specifically, but I think if you just focus on the edge habitat where you have good sun penetration into the edges of big timber stands, you're going to get all the salmonberry, you're going to get the red huckleberry, you're going to get the elderberry, you're going to get all that lush vegetation that they love to eat, and it's good security cover. So, I mean, that's kind of what I'm focused on.
I love that.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we're leaving out before we wrap this up? Like that you're like, hey, I want to make sure I hit this?
No, I think the scouting thing and using Onyx I'm a big fan of Onyx. They've been a big supporter of a lot of the stuff I'm doing at the state level with R3 and mentoring. A huge shout out to Onyx for that. But that being said, I'm a fan of any digital tools that people can employ, whether it's, base map, hunt stand, the Gaia maps or whatever, it's Gia maps, whatever it's called, whatever it takes. Like if you got to use Google Earth, that's a great tool as well. Phenomenal tool. They're all good tools, right? Pick one, get good with it, understand how to use it, and just it'll make you more confident. It'll make you smarter, and then just get out there and start observing, taking notes.
Yeah.
Don't assume anything you see in the woods is by happenstance, especially when it comes to a mature animal, whether it's elk, deer, bears, cougars. They are nowhere by accident. So
interesting.
And this I know nobody can see this, but this buck showed up last night.
Oh, that's beautiful.
20 minutes after I got out of my stand, So I'm like this close. Like I'm getting closer.
You're right there.
Yeah, and I got 2 weeks. So
Okay. Well, good luck. I can't wait to hear how it goes after those 2 weeks. I will say this, and it's interesting that you brought up use every technology available to support you on your journey. When it comes to bear hunting, and especially in the state of Washington, I don't know about other states what websites they offer. Washington Trails Association is your best friend when it comes to scouting for locations for animals, because every hiker in the woods is always like, "Oh, the berries are in. Oh, we were eating the berries. Oh, hey, we saw
yeah,
we saw some grouse, or we saw,
yeah,
like." And you let
that's a good.
and then you could go back year to year chronologically to the specific dates that you want to
Yeah,
hunt and get information on specific trails.
that mindset right there is a great way to wrap this up, because I think that's what you have to do. Is, I used to call Department of Transportation and WashDOT up here and ask about roadkill frequency, because I wondered why they put the deer crossing signs up, and
Oh
it
yeah.
has to be data behind that. And um, I think being inquisitive and always trying to peel the onion back and find more data sources is really the best thing that you can do as a blacktail hunter. Is just be resourceful, talk to, honestly, with all the Amazon drivers around now,
Talk to
the
them.
guy shows up at your house. That guy's been driving these roads since September. All he does is drive around, or she. So why don't you ask him, hey, you seen any deer lately? You know,
Dude,
send them on their
that's
way
a
with
good idea.
send them on their way with a bag of jerky, and maybe they'll have some good intel for you.
I love it. You got my inquisitive mind going real quick. Why do they place deer crossing signs in certain areas? Is it an actual like heavy crossing?
It's a historical area for car or vehicle incidents. Yeah.
Oh.
Uh,
So when
so
the joke the meme on social media is like when a hunter hunts near a deer crossing sign. Like, hey,
yeah, yeah.
I'm expecting one to show up.
Well, I went as far as to ask them if there's a rhyme or reason to which direction the sign is facing,
Uh-huh.
like the deer, because they have them for both. And they said, the guy laughed at me. I was like, all right, I'll back off. I know I'm reaching, but since I got you on the phone, like,
That is awesome. I love it. I love it. Well,
I
Tom,
told you, I kind of nerd out on this stuff.
dude,
So it's
it's the best. I love it. We, what is it? The saying, as always, either you are green and growing or you're ripe and rotting, right? Like if we can constantly gain knowledge and continue our journey and dial it in even more,
yeah,
um, we're never there. It's nice that
no,
once you get that,
no,
big deer or mature animal, but
yeah.
ultimately it's like we're still going.
Every year's a new season. Every year there's something to learn. I mean, I just got such a kick out of watching those spikes last night. They were even mounting each other, and I was like, "You guys are so confused." I mean, it was just hilarious. But I mean, it's good entertainment. But yeah, hey, my headset's about to die. I've got the voice now popping in my ears saying battery low for about 20 minutes. So
We'll wrap this up. Hey, Tom, where can people get a hold of you at?
uh oh, can
I can still
you hear
hear
me?
you. Yes, I can still hear you.
Okay. Got it third time. Well, pnwbowhunting.com.
Okay.
That's the best way. And then there's a contact form on there that goes to my uh, Tom at pnwbowhunting.com or tmryle@gmail.com. They both end up in the same spot. So
Awesome. Well, for the sake of your earbuds dying and all that, guys, thank you so much for tuning in this episode. Hope you gained a lot of insight and you are able to apply this for your coming hunts and your coming seasons. The whole idea is that mentorship is conservation. If you want hunting to last for generations to come, then you got to invest in the hearts and lives of other people. And there's no better person to do that than Tom Ryle, who is dedicated towards inspiring and getting people their first successes and continued success. If this episode is something that you liked, please share it, subscribe, leave a comment, a rating, review. Let me know what type of episode you want me to keep delivering, as we are always on a mission to transform lives through primal adventure. I'm Johnny Mack for Tom Ryle and PNW Bow Hunting. Be blessed, freedom on, and as always, stay soulful. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to support the show, you can always like, share, subscribe, and leave a rating as it helps us share our mission of mentorship is conservation. Thank you so much for tuning in and being a part of Soul Seekers Nation as we transform lives through primal adventure.